Hello folks, and welcome back to another case study where I talk about some of the strangest state and national park missing person cases out there. Before we begin, I wanted to update y'all by saying I'm working on a new volume of missing person cases and will probably be posting that video soon, so you can look forward to that in the coming days. Speaking of which, I've decided to choose this next case not only because of the strange circumstances behind it, but it also ties in with another disappearance that I'll be addressing in Volume 24. There are some similarities between that case and the one I'll be discussing in this video, and that involves the strange disappearance of a 34-year-old man named Joseph Lee Wood Jr., who vanished during the hike inside the Mount Rainier National Park on July 8th of 1999. Before we get into the details behind his disappearance, here's a little about who Joe was and what attracted him to Mount Rainier. According to sources, and I'll list them in the video description, Joe Wood Jr. was an African-American editor at the New Press, a New York publisher and former editor of The Village Voice. He had flown to Seattle on July 7th of 1999 to attend a special conference called the Unity 99, which was a national conference for minority journalists. He was a Yale graduate, and in 1990, he had received a New York Foundation Award for the Arts Fellowship, which enabled him to travel to Ghana and publish a book called Blood Whispers and Color Lines. As a young man, Joe was a keen lover of nature and the outdoors in general, and even joined the Boy Scouts, eventually reaching an Eagle Scout, which is the highest honor given for the organization. By the time he reached this point, he was considered an expert in the outdoors and had a comprehensive understanding of wilderness survival. So on Thursday, July 8th of 1999, Joe drove out to Mount Rainier National Park to take a solo hiking trip and to do some bird watching on the 14.5 thousand-foot mountain located 60 miles southeast of Seattle. He entered the park about 12:30 according to the car park receipt at the Nisqually entrance. He drove to the Longmire area and started his trek, heading towards Mildred Point. He was not equipped for a lengthy hike and was dressed only in a light shirt and khakis. He brought a set of binoculars and carried a book to study birds, as the weather was perfect that day in the park. This, unfortunately, was Joe's last known whereabouts, and even after 18 years, no trace of him has ever been found. When he failed to reappear at the conference the following day, his friends were surprised but not alarmed. When he had failed to return home to New York on Sunday, July 11th, his ex-partner, Somini Sengupta, a reporter for the New York Times, who was also at the Unity Conference, raised the alarm. By Tuesday, July 13th, Somini had filed a missing person report with the Mount Rainier National Park Service, and on the next day, park officials found Woods' rental car in a Mount Rainier parking area. It was then that Somini and other friends of Joe traveled to the mountain and attempted to retrace his footsteps by following information provided by the park on his last known whereabouts. I'm assuming this was possible through the information provided on the permit receipt they found in Joe's rental car. After a short time, though no specifics are given, the group was advised to turn back by park officials due to safety involving harsh weather conditions. So here's where things get a little bit interesting. On July 15th, a week after Joe's disappearance, park rangers were contacted by a hiker named Bruce Gaumond, who recognized Joe in a local newspaper story and decided to call him. Gaumond stated that he had met Joe on the Ramparts Ridge Trail on an altitude of about 4,800 feet on July 8th at around 2 p.m. that day, and they had briefly spoken. Joe had asked whether the snow-covered trail continued much further up. Bruce told him that he'd gone up about another 5 or 10 minutes, but turned around at a snow bridge, which looked dangerous to cross. After their brief conversation, Bruce stated that he headed back down the trail, while Joe continued onward. I was unable to find other specifics about this conversation, and if there was any mention of Joe's hiking plans beyond that point. However, park rangers used this information to piece together a possible hiking route that Joe likely took. According to them, Joe's 3-hour hike took him through dense forests of the western hemlock and Douglas fir forest with 4 to 6 foot high compacted snow blankets, which partly covered the trails. The Longmire area and Rampart Ridge Trail are at the southwest side of Mount Rainier, crossing Pearl and Devil's Dream Creeks. At 4,800 feet, it goes on to 4 small lakes, including Squaw Lake. And according to the weather reports, the winter of 1999 brought heavy snowfall to the mountain, but then as much as 2 feet of snow melted in the warmer days following his disappearance, which meant that any tracks he left behind would have been gone. On July 13th, the same day he was reported missing, the National Park Service organized search teams involving more than 100 personnel, including backcountry rangers, firefighters, and volunteers. Some of these volunteers included Joe's ex-partner and friends that we discussed earlier. Squads with search dogs also worked in grids, combing the entire southwest face of the mountain. A helicopter was also dispatched and brought in to assist from above. A few days into the search, the weather began to change for the worse. On July 16th, heavy rains fell and winds picked up to around 25 to 30 miles per hour, causing safety concerns for all those involved in the search. It was then that the official search was terminated, and the many personnel involved were convinced that Joe may have succumbed to the elements, with hypothermia being the most likely cause. Now, before we get into any theories about what may have happened to Joe, I just want to talk a little bit about the park itself in general, just to give you an idea of what Joe was up against. Mount Rainier National Park, a 370 square mile Washington State reserve southeast of Seattle, surrounds the glacier-capped 14.5 thousand foot Mount Rainier. It was established in 1899 as the 5th national park in the U.S. The park encompasses 240,000 acres, and the active volcanic mountain rises abruptly from the surrounding land, with elevations in the park ranging from 1,600 feet to over 15,000, and is considered the highest point in the Cascade Mountain ranges. The park contains valleys, waterfalls, 91,000 acres of subalpine meadows and old-growth forest, and more than 25 glaciers. The volcano is often shrouded in clouds that dump enormous amounts of rain and snow on the peak every year. Mount Rainier is circled by the Wonderland Trail and is covered by several glaciers and snowfields, totaling some 35 square miles. The mountain is a popular peak for hikers, drawing around 10,000 attempts per year, with only about 50% making it to the summit. So now that we have an idea of just how large the park is, let's talk a little bit about what may have happened to Joe. Longmire, the area where Joe had left his car, is the second most popular destination for visitors at the park. Of the more than 1.3 million people who visited the park in 2000, 38% of them visited the area and hiked the same trail that he was last seen on. The Cougar Rock Campground is about 2 miles northwest of Longmire, with 173 individual campsites and 5 group sites, and is open from late May through late September. Longmire is one of the starting points of the Wonderland and Rampart Ridge trails. Also in that same area, we have the Mount Rainier Inn, which is the only accommodation in the park open all year round. I was unable to find any specifics about the amount of people in that area during the time of Joe's disappearance, but based on these details, I would assume Joe was not alone out there. I think it's safe to say that a nice sunny day in July would encourage many folks to go on a hike, especially in the second most popular destination on that mountain. If something happened to Joe in that area, chances are people would have been witness to it. According to Joe's friends, Joe had a heart condition which he only discovered a few months prior to disappearing after having a fainting spell in an airport. Now, if he had another fainting spell in those woods, chances are someone would have stumbled across him, especially those search dogs. But what I want to know is how far up that Rampart Ridge trail did Joe make it? We know that he at least made it to around 4,800 feet in elevation, based on what Bruce Gauman stated when he met Joe on that trail. Now, is it possible he saw someone else matching Joe's description? We also know that Bruce advised Joe about a potentially dangerous snow bridge area about 5 to 10 minutes further up that trail. Was search and rescue able to spend an adequate amount of time searching that area, just in case Joe did have an accident? We also need to consider the fact that Joe may have been met with foul play and taken out of the park. With all the visitors coming and going, how easy would it have been to abduct someone from that area? Is it possible he disappeared on his own accord? Was he having suicidal thoughts, or was he going through some kind of depression during that time? Well, friends and family stated that he was in good spirits and looking forward to getting his book published. Given the excellent weather conditions on the day he disappeared on or near the Rampart Ridge Trail, it seems very odd that he would disappear without a trace. If there was a large storm on the day that he vanished, it might make a bit more sense, but the snow melted significantly just after he went missing. So if he did suffer an accident, such as falling off that snow bridge or succumbing to the elements, evidence would most likely point to this, and he would have been visible to searchers. Not only was there no evidence of this, there were no evidence of any animal attacks either. The only evidence ever recovered was his car parked at the trailhead, and even after 18 years, the complete lack of evidence in Joe's disappearance is baffling, and is the reason I decided to share this case. I thought I'd mention that others have vanished in that park as well and have never been found. James Campy, John Hepworth, John Foote, Lynn Lowell, Akuk Lewis, Joe Murphy, Chet Hansen, David Taylor, and Eric Lewis are just a few of the more well-known cases which continue to baffle many as to how they disappeared. It's no secret that Mount Rainier can be a dangerous place to venture if you're not cautious or prepared. The park has claimed too many lives over the years, and 9 out of 10 times, their deaths are no mystery and their bodies often recovered. But for the poor folks like Joe Wood, we may never have closure as to what happened. I believe the answer to his disappearance is still out there on that trail. And perhaps someday we'll discover the missing piece of the puzzle that'll crack this case wide open. But until then, we can only hope that some evidence will come forward for the sake of the many friends and family Joe had that are still searching for clues. Thank you for joining me on this case, and may we never forget the strange disappearance of Joseph Lee Wood Jr.